Leave my sight. Your presence is no longer required.
She was standing barefoot in the freezing mud. No cloak. No shoes. The cold had turned the courtyard stones into a landscape of sharp ridges and ice, and the rain was coming down hard enough that each drop hit her skin like a small blade. 2 guards had just released her arms. The bruises they left behind were already turning purple against her pale skin. The doors of the manor were open behind them, wide open, pouring warm golden light down the stone steps like a deliberate cruelty. The light was close enough to touch and entirely out of reach. Standing at the top of those steps, sheltered from the rain by the deep stone archway, was the Dowager Duchess Eleanor Sterling. She wore heavy black mourning silk and a fur collar that framed a face that had long ago traded warmth for calculation. She looked down at the girl in the mud the way a landowner looks at an infestation, not with rage, but with a cool, absolute dismissal that was somehow worse than rage. She does not belong here. The Dowager Duchess delivered the words at a perfectly measured volume. Not shouting. Not heated. Just decided. Throw her bags into the road and lock the gates. Now. The head guard stepped forward toward the small canvas bag resting in the mud. He was going to hurl it through the iron gates. He was going to do it with the casual efficiency of a man who had done this kind of thing before. And that is when they all heard it. Hoofbeats. Not the measured clip of a horse returning home at a reasonable hour. These were the hoofbeats of a massive animal being driven at full speed through the dark, through the rain, through the open iron gates of the estate without the rider slowing down at all. The black stallion tore into the courtyard like a force of nature. The rider pulled hard on the reins at the last possible moment, forcing the beast to rear back. Iron shoes struck sparks off the cobblestones. The horse landed with a crash that sent freezing water and mud spraying across the boots of both guards. Julian Sterling, the Duke of Harrington, dropped from the saddle before the animal had fully stopped moving. He was 6 feet and 3 inches of barely contained fury dressed in a rain-heavy greatcoat. He had been gone for 8 months. He had returned a week early. He looked at the guards. He looked at his mother on the dry steps. He looked at the bruised, barefoot girl shivering in the frozen mud. And something in his expression turned absolutely still. Stay with us. Because what happens next changes everything for both of them, and what happens in part 4 will leave you unable to look away. Her name was Clara Ashworth. She was 22 years old. She had been employed at Harrington Manor for 3 years, beginning as a scullery maid and working her way up to the specific, unglamorous task of cleaning the cold fireplaces before the household woke each morning. She swept the ashes from a dozen hearths every dawn before any member of the family or their guests descended the stairs. It was work that made a person invisible. That invisibility turned out to be the most valuable thing Clara had ever possessed. Because powerful people do not bother to lower their voices around servants. They speak freely in front of women who carry ash buckets. They leave documents on desks in rooms they assume are empty. They conduct conversations across dining tables while the girl refilling the water pitcher pretends to be furniture. Clara spent 3 years listening. In her first year she heard the Dowager Duchess instruct Baron Alastair on the routing of grain shipments. She did not understand what she was hearing. She filed it away. In her second year she heard the estate steward report figures that did not match the physical reality of the harvest she had watched from the servants' hall windows. Thousands of tons of grain loaded onto merchant ships, recorded in the ledgers as a total loss to Frost. She filed that away too. In her third year, she began to understand the shape of what she was looking at. She had spent her childhood in the ashes of collapsed estates. Her father had been a clerk for a baronet whose steward had stolen the estate into ruin over the course of 15 years. She had watched her family lose their modest house, their furniture, their dignity in a sequence of events that began with falsified numbers and ended with creditors at the door in January. She knew exactly what financial fraud looked like when it was done slowly and carefully over many years. She began to keep her own ledger. She kept it hidden beneath the floorboards of her small room in the servants' quarters, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp. Each morning after the fireplaces were swept, she wrote down what she remembered. Each number she had seen. Each discrepancy she had noticed. Each name she had heard in rooms where the powerful people forgot to be careful. Then, 6 months ago, she had received a letter. It arrived through the estate post in a plain envelope with no return name, only a wax seal she had seen once before, stamped into correspondence from the Duke of Harrington himself. He was away in the north at the time, managing the trade route negotiations that had kept him absent for the better part of a year. The letter was brief. It told her that he was aware of irregularities in the estate accounts. It told her that he needed someone he could trust, someone already on the inside, to locate the original ledger his mother kept hidden and compare it against the official estate records. It told her exactly where to look. It asked if she was willing. Clara had read the letter twice. She folded it carefully and placed it inside the oilcloth with her private records. She went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling for a long time, thinking about her father's face when the creditors came, thinking about what it felt like to watch a house collapse from the inside while the people destroying it went on to live perfectly comfortable lives. In the morning she got up, cleaned the fireplaces, and went to find the ledger. She found it. She was in the Dowager Duchess's private study when the old woman's personal maid walked in and saw her. The maid screamed. Within 20 minutes, Clara was standing in the freezing mud of the courtyard with 2 guards holding her arms. That was where the Duke found her. Julian walked directly to the head guard without breaking stride. He did not ask a question. He did not issue a warning. He drove his heavy leather riding glove into the man's jaw with the full force of his considerable body behind it. The sound was sickening, the crack of bone, and the guard dropped into the mud without a word. Julian turned his dark eyes toward the second guard. The man immediately raised his hands and stepped back 3 full paces. He was a large man, experienced in handling difficult situations on the estate, and the expression on the Duke's face made him feel very small. Julian pointed at the open iron gates. "Walk through them." His voice was dangerously low, the kind of quiet that is far more threatening than shouting. "Never return to this county. If I see your face on my land again, I will let the hounds hunt you." The second guard did not wait to hear anything else. He turned and walked into the storm at a pace that was almost, but not quite, running. Julian turned to face the steps. The Dowager Duchess had maintained her rigid posture throughout. She was good at this, the architecture of unshakable composure built over decades of navigating drawing rooms where weakness was a wound that never healed. But the color had gone from her face, and her hands had tightened on her fur collar. "Julian." She kept her voice controlled. "The girl is a thief. She was found in my private study. She was touching documents that do not concern her." Julian did not answer. He reached up and unfastened the silver clasp at his throat. He stripped his enormous rain-heavy greatcoat from his shoulders and walked through the freezing rain toward the girl standing in the mud. He draped the thick, warm wool around her trembling frame. The coat swallowed her. It reached her ankles. It smelled of cedar and frost and wet leather and the long cold road. Clara pressed her lips together and said nothing. Julian picked up her muddy canvas bag. "She was in your study," he said, still not looking at his mother, "because I wrote to her and asked her to find the missing accounts. I have known about the missing estate funds for 6 months. I needed someone I could trust to locate the ledger you kept hidden." The Dowager Duchess went perfectly still. Julian looked down at the bruises on Clara's arms. A muscle moved in his jaw with a precise, controlled violence. "We are going inside." He placed one hand gently on her back, guiding her toward the steps. "Tomorrow, you will show me exactly what you found." The estate was quiet the next morning with the specific quietness of a house that is frightened. The servants moved through the corridors with focused precision, keeping their eyes down and their footsteps light. The Dowager Duchess had sealed herself into the west wing. No breakfast. No visitors. No communication with anyone. In the Duke's study, a fire was burning. Clara sat in the massive leather chair behind the mahogany desk. She was wearing a dark blue velvet dress that Julian had ordered the housekeeper to provide, something simple, something with sleeves long enough to cover the bruising on her arms. The dress was far finer than anything she had worn in 3 years, and it fit her with an elegance that had nothing to do with the garment itself. She opened the ledger. Julian stood at the tall window, looking out at the frozen gardens. He held a glass of amber liquid that he had not yet touched. The morning light came in cold and gray and illuminated the sharp lines of his profile, the tension in his jaw, the tight set of his shoulders. "Show me the rot," he said, turning from the window. Clara pointed to the 3rd page. Her finger traced a column of figures, the winter grain harvest, recorded as a complete loss due to frost across 3 consecutive seasons. She set the ledger aside and opened the second document, shipping manifests from the harbor. She laid them side by side on the polished desk. The harvest was recorded as a loss, she said. But the merchant ships leaving the harbor in November carried 10,000 tons of grain. It was registered under a false company name. Here, and again here in the spring manifest. Julian leaned forward over the desk. His large hands pressed flat against the polished wood, bringing his face close to hers. She could smell cold linen and sharp winter air. Who controls the false company? Baron Alistair. She looked up and met his gaze directly. Your mother's brother. Julian closed his eyes. He took a long, slow breath, pulling the anger down into a cold controlled place where it would be useful rather than destructive. He had learned this discipline young, in a household where emotion was treated as a liability. He opened his eyes and looked at the woman sitting in his chair. You have a dangerous mind, Clara. He straightened. You risked your life pulling these numbers together while you cleaned my mother's fireplaces. I did not want to see this house collapse. She kept her voice even. I have lived in the ashes of ruined estates before. The cold of that kind of ruin is something you never forget. Julian moved around the desk. He stood beside her chair and looked down at her pale profile, the careful composure, the ink stains on her fingertips, the bruise at her wrist. He reached out and gently touched the edge of the darkest mark with his thumb. You will not clean another fireplace in this house. He kept his voice quiet. You will take the office adjacent to mine. You will assume full control of the estate ledgers. Every pound that moves through Harrington land will require your signature. Clara looked at his hand resting on her wrist. The warmth of his skin was unexpectedly steadying in the quiet room. The servants will not accept orders from a scullery maid, she said. The aristocracy of the county will laugh at you. Let them laugh. He moved his hand away and walked toward the heavy oak door. They will stop laughing when we begin seizing their assets for unpaid debts. Start drafting the letters to my uncle. Clara spent the next 3 weeks transforming the operational core of the estate. She worked with a ruthless precision that was alarming to the older clerks, who had spent years benefiting from the comfortable chaos of misfiled records and unchallenged accounts. She found misplaced funds, money that had drifted sideways into unofficial accounts through a process of careful, incremental redirection. She found forged receipts for agricultural expenses that had never occurred. She found debts owed to the estate that had simply never been collected, allowed to accumulate quietly over years until they were large enough to be dangerous. She recovered thousands of pounds simply by demanding accurate counting. She did not return to the servants' quarters. She slept in a room in the east wing with a fire that burned through the night, and she woke early enough to see the sun come up over the frozen gardens, not to clean the ashes from the grate, but because the light on the frost was extraordinary and she had never had a window that faced east before. She took her meals with Julian in the small private dining room. They spoke of crop yields and shipping taxes and the slow, systematic dismantling of the corruption his mother had spent years building. They did not speak of anything personal. They did not need to. But something in the silence between them was changing. It was no longer the silence of an employer and an employee. It was no longer even the silence of two people engaged in a shared mission. It was becoming the silence of two people who had spent enough time in each other's company that the quiet itself had grown comfortable, warm in the way that warm things become when they are earned rather than simply given. Julian watched her constantly. He watched the precise way she pinned her dark hair back with a single silver comb before she sat down to work. He watched the small vertical line that appeared between her brows when a ledger did not balance and the focused intensity with which she hunted it down until it did. He watched the ink stains that accumulated on her fingers by mid-morning and the way she never seemed to notice them. He watched the fierce, quiet set of her jaw when a senior clerk tried to give her a deliberately incorrect figure, and the exact, careful way she corrected the man without raising her voice or breaking eye contact until the clerk looked away first. He was beginning to understand that the estate was not the only thing she was bringing back to life. If you are still watching, you are exactly who this channel is made for. Hit the subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment before you keep reading, which moment so far hit the hardest? The mud in the courtyard? The ledger? Or the silence that was changing? Tell us below, and then stay, because part 3 is where this story stops being about money entirely. The trap was set on a Thursday evening, in the last week of January, when the snow was falling thick enough to bury the roads. Clara was working late in the archive room on the ground floor. It was a narrow, high-ceilinged space lined floor to ceiling with shelves of old parchment and bound records going back 2 centuries. The room smelled of aged leather and cold stone and the faint mustiness of documents that had not been opened in years. A single oil lamp cast long, deep shadows across the shelves. She was looking for a specific land grant from the previous century, a document detailing the water rights for the southern farms, which had become relevant to a dispute with a neighboring estate that Clara suspected was being deliberately manufactured to drain Harrington funds through legal fees. She was reaching for a shelf near the back of the room when she heard it. The heavy iron door clicked shut behind her. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the stone room with the clean finality of something being decided. Clara turned. Walked to the door. Pulled the handle. Locked from the outside. She did not panic. She turned back to the shelves, lifted her oil lamp, and took stock of the room. She was noting the height of the barred window near the ceiling, too high, bars too thick, when she noticed the smell. Sharp. Bitter. The specific chemical bite of burning sulfur. Smoke began to curl under the gap at the bottom of the iron door. The Dowager Duchess had not retreated quietly into the west wing to lick her wounds and accept the inevitable. She had decided that the simplest solution to a dangerous woman was to remove the dangerous woman entirely, and to destroy the evidence at the same time. A fire in the archive room would accomplish both. Clara stood in the center of the room and assessed the situation with the same precise, unfrightened intelligence she brought to everything else. The smoke was already thickening. She had less than 10 minutes before the air became unbreathable. The window was out. The door was iron. She took off her velvet jacket and pressed it tight against the gap under the door, slowing the smoke. She moved to the center of the archive and began to think. The primary ledgers, the ones that documented the fraud in specific, court-admissible detail, were on the lower shelves, well within the reach of the fire. She began moving them, armload by armload, to the highest shelves she could reach, understanding that heat rises and the upper shelves would stay cooler longest. Her eyes were watering. Her throat was burning. She kept working. In the upper gallery, Julian caught the first thread of smoke. He did not call for the servants. He moved. He took the grand staircase 3 steps at a time, moving through the dark upper corridors with the focused violence of a man who already knew exactly where he needed to be. He hit the ground floor and turned toward the archive. The smoke was thickest near the iron door. He could see it seeping from the gap at the bottom, could see the deadbolt locked into place. He did not search for the key. He stepped back into the corridor, creating distance, and drove his boot directly into the center of the door. The metal groaned. The stone around the hinges cracked. He kicked it again. And again. The third blow focused everything, his full weight, his fury, the absolute unwillingness to stop, directly into the locking mechanism, and the door ruptured inward, tearing the hinges from the stone wall in a shower of mortar and iron. He rushed into the smoke. Clara was on the floor near the back wall, her dress pressed over her mouth, coughing with a violence that shook her entire body. Her eyes were streaming. Julian dropped to his knees beside her. He got his arms under her and lifted her completely off the floor, not helping her up, not guiding her, simply picking her up and carrying her out of the burning room and down the corridor toward the kitchen courtyard. He kicked the exterior door open with his foot and carried her out into the falling snow. The cold air hit them both like a wave. He set her down on the stone bench but kept his arms around her, and for a long moment neither of them moved. The snow came down quiet and steady around them. Clara's coughing slowed. Her breathing steadied. "I am fine." Her voice was rough. She pressed her hands against his chest and sat up slightly, trying to reassemble her composure. The fire did not reach the main ledgers. "I moved them to the upper shelves." Julian looked down at her soot-streaked face. His eyes were entirely dark, not with the cold calculated anger he had shown his mother, but with something rawer and less managed. A terror that had not yet fully resolved into relief. He raised his hand and wiped a streak of black ash from her cheek with his thumb. The gesture was so careful and so quiet that it seemed to belong to a different register than everything else that had happened that evening. "I do not care about the ledgers." He pulled her back against his chest and pressed his face into her dark hair. "I care about the woman who reads them." Clara closed her eyes. She rested her hands flat against his chest and felt the rapid, uneven rhythm of his heart beneath the linen. She thought about the door, the iron door that had been locked from the outside with the specific intention of killing her, and about what it had taken to bring it down. "Your mother locked the door," she said quietly. "She used sulfur to start the fire in the corridor outside." Julian went perfectly still. The warmth in his arms was replaced by something colder and more absolute. He held her for another moment, and then he released her and stepped back. His face had returned to the expression she recognized, the hard, controlled mask of a man who has decided that a thing is going to happen and is now simply working out the details. She has made her final mistake. His voice was quiet in the falling snow. "Tomorrow night is the winter assembly. We will let her attend. And then we will destroy her entirely." The winter assembly was the most important social event of the season in the county. It was held in the grand ballroom of Harrington Manor, a room of extraordinary proportions, with soaring ceilings, walls of pale marble, and 3 enormous crystal chandeliers that together held more than 500 candles. On assembly nights the room became a kind of theater, and everyone present was both performer and audience simultaneously. Tonight, every notable family in the county was in attendance. The Dowager Duchess stood near the center of the room, surrounded by the usual constellation of wealthy admirers and social dependents who had orbited her for years. She wore deep purple velvet and a diamond necklace that caught the candlelight like crushed glass. She looked, to anyone who did not know what had happened in the archive room 2 nights ago, like a woman in complete command of her world. She had convinced herself that the fire had accomplished its purpose. The girl had survived, inconveniently, but the ledgers had surely been destroyed. Without the ledgers, there was no proof of anything. Without proof, there was no case. Without a case, the dangerous, extraordinary girl who had spent 3 years cleaning ashes and 3 weeks dismantling the careful work of years was simply a scullery maid making accusations. The Dowager Duchess smiled at something her companion said and touched her diamonds with one hand, reassured by their weight. The massive double doors of the ballroom opened. The sound of 500 conversations died. Not gradually. All at once, the way a candle is snuffed. Julian walked into the ballroom. He wore a perfectly tailored black evening coat over a white cravat, and his face wore the expression of total aristocratic composure that the county had known since he was a boy, except that tonight it was cold in a way that made the room feel several degrees lower than it was. Clara walked beside him. She was not wearing the dark blue velvet of an employee. She was not wearing the simple, functional clothing of a woman with work to do. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk threaded with silver that caught the light of 500 candles with every step she took. Her dark hair was swept up and back in a style that was elegant without being effortful, pinned with a single sapphire comb. She moved with the quiet, absolute certainty of a woman who had stopped apologizing for taking up space. Every eye in the room followed them. They walked together down the center of the ballroom, the crowd parting before them with an instinctive deference that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with the force field of combined authority they projected. They stopped directly in front of the Dowager Duchess. The old woman's face remained perfectly composed. "Julian." She produced a tight, practiced smile. "I see you have brought your clerk to the assembly. It is highly irregular." "She is not my clerk," Julian said. His voice carried clearly across the silent room without any apparent effort. "She is the savior of this estate." The whispers moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Julian reached inside his coat and produced a thick, folded document bearing the heavy red wax seal of the royal magistrate. Clara stepped forward. She did not look at the floor. She did not look at the chandeliers or the crowd or the exits. She looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had ordered her thrown into the mud, who had tried to burn her alive in a locked room, who had told her with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been wrong about anything that she did not belong here. "We located the missing funds." Clara's voice was clear and carried with the same natural authority as Julian's. Every person in the room could hear her perfectly. "Baron Alistair confessed to the fraud yesterday morning. He provided a complete account of the scheme, including the letters you wrote instructing him to divert the grain shipments and register them under the false company name." The room was perfectly silent. The Dowager Duchess's diamonds trembled at her throat. "Lies." The old woman looked around at the faces of her friends and allies. "She is a common scullery maid attempting to steal my son's title. She has no standing here. She has no authority. She belongs in the magistrate has issued a warrant for your arrest." Julian handed the document to the county sheriff, who was standing near the refreshment table and who had, Clara understood, been placed there by prearrangement. "You will leave this ballroom. You will return to your chambers under guard. Tomorrow morning you will be transported to the royal prison to await trial." The crowd drew in a single collective breath. "You cannot do this to me," the Dowager Duchess said. Her voice had lost its careful calibration, the aristocratic polish cracking away to reveal something raw and frightened underneath. "I am the Duchess of Harrington. You were the Duchess of Harrington." Julian looked down at her with complete dismissal. Not anger. Not triumph. Simply the finality of a man closing a ledger. "You are now a thief awaiting a cold cell." The sheriff placed a hand on the old woman's arm. She did not make a scene. She had been too many things in her life to unmake herself entirely in a ballroom full of witnesses. She walked with the sheriff toward the side exit, passing through the brilliant, crowded light of the room toward the shadows of the corridor beyond. She did not look back. The doors closed behind her. Julian turned to face the room. The silence was absolute and waiting. He looked at Clara. "Will you dance?" Clara looked at his outstretched hand. The silk of her gown caught the light from 500 candles. Her heart was beating with an uneven warmth that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the evening. "I do not know the steps." She looked up at him. "I will teach you." He stepped closer, closing the small distance between them. His voice was quiet now, not the carrying voice of a man addressing a crowd, but the private voice of a man speaking to one person. "I am very good at leading." She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain, and he drew her gently toward the center of the polished floor. The orchestra began. A slow, sweeping waltz that filled the enormous room from floor to ceiling with something that felt, in that particular moment, like permission. They moved together beneath the chandeliers, his hand firm on the small of her back, her hand resting in his, and around them the 500 guests of the county's grandest assembly watched with the riveted attention of people who understood that they were witnessing something that would be spoken about for years. Clara looked up at him. The suffocating cold she had carried her entire adult life, the cold of the ash bucket, the cold of the mud, the cold of the locked archive door, was finally, completely, unmistakably gone. Play button if that ballroom scene gave you chills. This channel has many more stories built exactly like this one. Subscribe to Regent Hearts right now. Bell, hit the notification bell so the next story comes directly to you. Speech balloon, tell us in the comments, did you see the archive fire coming? And which moment hit you hardest, the courtyard, the ledger, or the dance? Your comments tell us what to make next. Keep reading, part 5 is where everything becomes permanent. The assembly had ended hours ago. The guests had returned to their estates and their households carrying the greatest scandal the county had produced in living memory. The servants had extinguished the candles and gone to bed. The grand ballroom was dark and empty, the only sound the distant settling of the old stone building as the temperature outside continued to drop. Julian and Clara were alone in his private library. The massive stone fireplace held the slow, red embers of a fire that had burned down to its final warmth. The room was illuminated in an unsteady amber light that moved across the leather bindings and the dark wood and the Persian rugs with the easy rhythm of something that had nowhere to be. Clara stood at the window. The snow had stopped falling sometime during the assembly, leaving the landscape in a perfect, unbroken white, the gardens, the frozen fountain, the iron gates, all of it wrapped in a silence that felt ancient. She had taken out the sapphire comb and let her hair down. It fell over her shoulders in dark waves, still carrying the warmth of the evening. She held the comb loosely in one hand, turning it slowly. Julian sat in the leather chair by the fire, watching her. He had removed his evening coat and undone the collar of his shirt. He looked, for the first time in the weeks she had known him, entirely at rest. "The royal carriage will arrive at dawn," he said, quietly, into the warm room. "She will be transported to London. She will never return to this house." Clara turned from the window. She walked toward the fireplace, the silk of her gown making a soft sound against the rug. She stopped in front of the embers and looked into them for a moment, the red and amber glow, the last heat of a long fire, thinking about the archive room, about the smoke and the smell of sulfur and the way the locked door had sounded when she pulled the handle and understood what had been done. She burned the ledgers, Clara said. But she could not burn the truth. Julian stood up from the chair. He moved toward her, crossing the space between the chair and the fireplace in a few slow steps, and stopped close, within the intimate radius of personal space that two people only enter when they have decided to stop pretending they need more distance. He looked down at her face. The firelight caught the line of her cheekbone, the ink stain on her left index finger that she had not quite managed to remove, the faint shadow beneath her eyes from weeks of long nights over demanding ledgers. "You saved my legacy, Clara." His voice had the rough, careful quality of a man saying something he has thought about for a long time. "You brought order to a house that was rotting from the inside out." "It was mathematics," she said. The corner of her mouth moved. "Numbers do not lie. I am not speaking about the ledgers." He raised his hand and touched the side of her face, not her wrist this time, not the careful professional contact of a man examining a bruise, but her face, his palm warm against her cheek in the firelight. "I am speaking about you." Clara closed her eyes. The fierce, absolute control she had maintained for years, through the cold mornings and the invisible work and the dangerous secret of the ledger beneath the floorboards, began to release. Not collapse. Not break. Release, the way a fist unclenches after a very long time, the ache in the opening almost indistinguishable from relief. "I told you once that you did not belong in the ashes," Julian said. His thumb moved against her cheek. "I was wrong. You belong wherever you choose to be." You belong in the light. Clara opened her eyes. She looked at the man standing in front of her. She looked at the man who had returned from 8 months on the road and within 10 minutes of arriving home had driven a guard into the mud with his fist and stripped his own coat to put it around a barefoot girl standing in the cold. She looked at the man who had torn an iron door from its stone setting with his bare hands and carried her out into the snow and held her there without saying a single word about the ledgers until she brought them up herself. Then I choose to be here. The words were quiet, almost private, spoken into the small warm space between them. Julian let out a breath, slow and ragged, the last of something held for a very long time. He closed the remaining distance. He kissed her with the absolute certainty of a man who has arrived somewhere after a very long journey and recognized, with complete conviction, that this is where he was always going. There was no hesitation in it. There was only the fierce, devoted truth of two people who have spent months working side by side in the middle of a crisis and have arrived, gradually and then all at once, at the understanding that the crisis was never the point. Clara kissed him back with equal certainty, her hands finding the fabric of his shirt, her fingers tightening against the steady warmth of him. She let the past burn away, not violently, not dramatically, but the way morning burns away the last of the night. Quietly. Completely. Without looking back. When they finally drew apart they stayed close, foreheads resting together, breathing in the warmth of the library and the last red glow of the embers. I will make you the Duchess of Harrington. His voice was a vow spoken against her skin. The entire county will bow to you. I do not care about the county. The smile that came was real, completely, unguardedly real, a smile that belonged to a woman who no longer needed to keep it small. I only care about the ledgers. Julian laughed. It was a deep, rich sound that filled the library and echoed against the old stone walls, and Clara felt it against her hands where they rested on his chest, and she thought that she had spent 3 years in the ashes of this house and had not once, in all that time, heard the house laugh. He pulled her close again, his chin resting on the top of her head, and they stood together in the warm, amber light with the snow outside and the embers inside and the long, complicated road of everything that had brought them here finally behind them. The trial of the Dowager Duchess Eleanor Sterling was completed in the spring. Baron Alastair's confession was admitted as primary evidence. The shipping manifests, recovered from the upper shelves of the archive room, undamaged, exactly as Clara had placed them, were presented to the magistrate in full. The testimony of 3 senior estate clerks, who had spent years keeping silent out of fear and now found the balance of their fear had shifted, confirmed every detail. The Dowager Duchess was convicted of fraud and conspiracy. She was stripped of her title and sentenced to confinement. She did not attend the sentencing hearing. She sent a solicitor instead. Baron Alastair received a separate conviction on the same charges and returned to his much-reduced estate to face a string of additional civil claims from the tenants and merchants his scheme had damaged over the years. Harrington Manor, under Clara's management, recovered its financial footing within the year. The false debts were reversed. The misappropriated funds, those that could be traced, were partially recovered through the Baron's assets and the sale of a portion of the Dowager Duchess's jewelry, including the diamonds she had worn on the night of the winter assembly. In the late summer, on a warm evening when the gardens were green for the first time in Clara's memory of the estate, Julian married her in the small chapel at the edge of the south lawn. The ceremony was attended by the senior estate staff and a small number of county families whose continued financial dealings with Harrington Manor made their attendance not optional. The new Duchess of Harrington wore a gown of pale gold. She carried no flowers. She had never particularly seen the point of carrying something beautiful that was dying. She carried instead, in the small pocket sewn into the skirt by the estate seamstress at her specific request, the original letter Julian had sent her 8 months before, the letter that had asked her if she was willing. She had kept it in the oilcloth with the ledger. She kept it still. The Dowager Duchess had told her she did not belong there. She had been looking at a girl standing barefoot in the mud and seen nothing worth considering. What she had failed to see was a woman who had spent 3 years memorizing the language of numbers while the powerful people around her spoke freely, assuming the girl with the ash bucket was deaf. What she had failed to understand was that the girl in the mud was not standing there because she had lost. She was standing there because she had found exactly what she came to find, and was waiting, with the patient intelligence of someone who had learned long ago that endurance is a form of strategy, for the moment when it would matter. The moment came on horseback, at full speed, through the open iron gates. It always does, for women like Clara. The old Duchess had been completely, utterly, irreversibly wrong. Clara belonged at the center of the estate. She was the brilliant, unyielding, entirely self-made heart of a new empire, and she had the ledgers to prove it. If this story gave you that quiet, satisfied feeling of watching someone finally get exactly what they deserve, this is your channel. Subscribe to Duke's Secret and hit the bell. Every story here is built around a woman who endures, and a man who eventually understands the weight of what he almost lost. Speech Balloon, leave us a comment right now. What was your single favorite moment in this entire story? The courtyard? The ledger scene? The archive fire? The ballroom? The library? Your answer tells us exactly what to write next. We will see you in the next story.